Thank you again. This is a resilient group. Now that we've solved the early childhood education problem, we've solved K through 12 reform issues, we're now going to tackle college. Let me just preface this by saying that according to the U.S. Census Bureau, and this was kind of a headline a few years back, the number of people who've enrolled in college and trade schools has surged, and according to new government data, most of the new students are minorities. A 6% increase, the biggest since 1968. Latino enrollment grew by an eye-opening 15%, followed by African American enrollment, 8%, and Asians, 6%. So, the data apparently was pointing to increases in minority enrollment because it reflected three things: the nation's changing demographics, a 21% unemployment rate at the time among 16 to 19-year-olds, but also a significant increase in the number of minority high school graduates. A high school completion rate for Latinos was 70%, an all-time high, for example, and as we've just heard recently the president talk about record levels of graduation rates, high school graduation rates at over 80%. Community colleges saw an 11% spike in enrollment, in part because most minority students enrolled in community college rather than four-year schools. So I have to ask, Nick, what's wrong with that picture?
Let me just start by saying it's a privilege to be here. I got my start in education up the street, first in our streets on the McKinley Tech campus. I hate to say 15 years ago. We got a clap over there. That's good. Let me start by posing a question back to the group, which is, this keeps me up at night. What if, in a country that, President of the United States is calling for increased college completion rates, we are all talking this game of let's make sure that higher education is a cornerstone of opportunity, et cetera. What if we are sending students across a bridge to nowhere? What if we're setting them up to fail? And the reason I ask that question is that as you look at these numbers, I think one of the biggest open secrets in American education today is the difference between what it means to be eligible for college and truly ready. And so, in other words, increasing enrollments in higher education, we can't assume is just check the box. Yay, let's pat our, all of ourselves in the back and send out a bunch of notices to our supporters and say X numbers of our seniors are going to college. Because the reality is very different, right? I live in New York now. 70% of high school graduates in New York who are attending the CUNY system in New York require something called remedial coursework. 70%, that's not a typo, right? Same in California, rates are high, and yes, there's debate on these numbers, 20% nationwide, but like really disproportionately concentrated among young people of color enrolling in higher education, specifically community colleges. And what remedial coursework really means is that you have the, quote, opportunity to be in college and be, quote, enrolled in courses that, by the way, guess how much credit those courses count for? 0. Guess how much tuition kids are shouldering on their backs? Full. This difference, I think, it needs to be called out. And I think as someone who runs a nonprofit in partnership with high schools really dedicated to academic preparation, what would it take to make sure that there isn't a difference between what it means to be eligible and students to be ready to really enroll in credit-bearing coursework the minute they arrive on campus? That should be our charge.
So Nick, let's assume that Michelle Obama is sitting over there at the other end of that couch. And you know that she's been on the road saying, number one, many of these kids belong on some of our more elite institutions. Problem is there's some bottleneck, there's some problem with getting them there. Is she wrong?
First of all, I don't think she's wrong at all. I think one of the things that we are leaving behind is a mentality that students, no matter where you're born, no matter where you're from, that we need to be able to prepare students at the point of high school graduation to really have a genuine choice. Is higher education something that is right for your future, something that's right for your path? I'll call attention to a student who I'm still in touch with 15 years later. Some of the realizations that I've made about this space have really come by following a group of fourth graders, a fourth and fifth grade teacher, over a 15-year period and watching the ways that their lives evolved. And I want to introduce you to a young man who's up the street still named Travis. And Travis's experience is one where, even on his own terms, Travis wanted to go to college. He always said he's surrounded in a neighborhood, up McKinley Tech neighborhood, 6% of the population in that census tract as of 1990 had college degrees. So it's not a community with direct experience in higher education, but he's surrounded by people who are very committed to the idea that that is a central way of getting ahead in the world. And so Travis went through, he's a public school student, DCPS, and what I realized, paying really close attention to how Travis would navigate his classes, was that, yes, he wanted to go to college, but he found a way to game his classes and to game his teachers in a way that was highly strategic, super smart, but basically saying, if I pass my classes at a minimum level, and if I rack up all these credits, and if I'm distinguishing myself as a graduate of this school, and if I get accepted to higher education, all of these what researchers call attainment measures, if I just rack up all these attainment measures, I will have achieved my goal. And that's what he did, right? So he ended up going to a four-year college, and his teachers at the school, under the guise of, quote, helping him, let him negotiate so many different opportunities for makeup work. His effort followed this really, those of you who are in this room are nodding your heads. There are teachers who are like, the kids are going to come and say, like, I'm going to let my effort bottom out for a while, but right at the end of the marking period, or when things come home, like, can I please make up that assignment? Like, can I, like, and this kid was smart, man. This kid was like 50th percentile nationally in fourth grade, like higher than that for DC. And by the time he took his SATs, his scores were in the bottom 5% of test takers nationally. And I asked myself and asked him, like, dude, how is it that someone who's so smart and dedicated to this vision, you're doing nothing in school? Like, you're not actually doing core achievement work. And why is that? He goes, I'll tell you exactly why. Because teachers say, like, you can get A's, you can get B's. He said, I can get C's and D's and be exactly where I need to be to achieve my goals if we live in a country that defines success as enrollment in college. And so those two things in Travis's life, too, were completely inconsistent. What happened to Travis? Remedial courses, felt like a failure. Within 3 months, Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, he's back on his mom's couch. And so I'm really using stories like this to say, like, what would it take to truly ground students, not like superimposing some kind of rigorous coursework on their head for our sake, but to say, Travis, what kind of skills are you going to develop over time? What means something to you in terms of the type of person that you want to become long term? And by the way, here's what it's going to take to thrive. And that starts now. You're way too talented for that. So when we say epidemic of lost talent, I think of kids like Travis.
We're on the cusp, I believe, of a major overhaul of what we define as academic success, standards, holding people accountable. Common Core has been brought up earlier today. We're saying here that there is a disconnect already. How much larger of a disconnect can we anticipate if we begin to become even more narrow in our definition of what success is, whether it means doing well on standardized tests tethered to the Common Core? And what does that mean, especially for the kind of kids that you're talking about? What do you see happening there?
I think this disjuncture between eligible and ready is an issue that is far bigger than Common Core. And so let's circle back to Common Core in a second. But by way of illustration, for those of you who are familiar with these sort of high-stakes exit exams in New York State called Regents examinations, the algebra Regents examination has 87 questions on it historically. Anyone care to wager a guess on what number out of 87 the state has used to deem that you needed to get to pass your high-stakes test out of 87? 44, I heard it. What else? Someone said 60. 30. 31 some years, 33. Like a few questions over random guessing. So what we have is this architecture of, forget about whether the assessment's good or not. You have a situation where, regardless of the standards that are being used in class, you're defining passing at a level that is so unconscionably low. and then patting students on the back and saying, like, yes, that's what it means to pass, quote, high-stakes tests. And so I think there needs to be two things happening simultaneously. How are folks educating young people? So David Coleman has this line we were talking about before. We have to stop lying to our kids and families about what it takes. We cannot lie to them and say, you're ready or you're passing high school, when they don't know that they got 30 right at 87. You just create a scaled score on 100 that says that's actually a 65, well, however you make that jump, and that means passing, right? So we need to have this conversation out in the open at the same time that we really interrogate some of the assumptions about what rigorous academic prep looks like. And frankly, from my vantage, I think Common Core is a really important step towards the type of thinking that kids are going to need to do, regardless of they're going into higher ed or careers going forward.
Let me bring you back to college. One of the more alarming views out there is, or alarmist, is that colleges now are more divided by wealth than ever. In other words, this gap of people in this country who have the wherewithal, the haves versus the have-nots, that gap is now so pronounced on our college campuses. That would seem to then say, we're heading for some serious trouble in this country if we don't do something to give those have-nots an opportunity, first and foremost, and the skills to be able to succeed in that post-secondary environment. Now, having said what we've said here about the disconnect, my God, how do you get there? How do you begin to chip away at this gap that is so pronounced now?
Well, let's be real for a second, right? The fact that, yes, there's a tenfold completion rate dividend, wealth dividend for 92% of folks in the upper income top income quartile complete college. It's ticked up from 8 now to 9% of students in the bottom income quartile. So this is, if you split things in a pretty polarized way by class, that is an enormous gap. But that gap is also deeply historically interconnected with lingering and pervasive race and ethnic gaps in completion, and that these two things have not become completely untethered, as we all know. I think that that we're living through a moment where it's this type of seminar is evidence that more and more people are both caring and paying an enormous amount of tension and frankly debating and fighting about what the answer to your question is. And so for my perch at Blue Engine, which for those of you who don't know, we're in our 5th year out of New York City, designing a really student-centered model of small group instructional, sort of high-intensity tutoring alongside veteran regular teachers throughout 1 to 2 year terms of service that Blue Engine teaching assistants can sign up to do through AmeriCorps. And as a secondary consequence, those people learn and enter the teaching profession in a very new way. We're looking to grow beyond New York, but thinking pretty methodically about how to do that. But from my vantage point, I think it has to start 10 levels below policy questions, 10 levels below chartered debates, and just ask ourselves a really simple question. When a student walks into something that they call school, and they're expected to engage in something that's called learning, what are the current ways that they live, feel, fear, hope? What happens in the very, 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 very bottom of that interaction when you have one teacher teaching 30 students, even the best teacher teaching 30 students in a classroom? And in 30 years, I think we're going to look back and say, that model isn't going to get us there. And it's going to be some combination. I'm not a huge tech evangelist, if you can't tell. I'm like old school human capital, bring in people, we layer the right technologies, but at the base of that, it's about helping kids unlearn lessons they've been taught about their own potential, frankly, surrounding them by a community of people who are deeply caring, knowledgeable, and trained, and that it comes to resemble something we see in medicine or other fields where you have the central importance of lead teachers, and they're surrounded by people, in Blue Engine's case, with 2 or 3, 4 teaching assistants who can help personalize and differentiate instruction to the needs of young people and their core skills. I don't see a way forward in the K-12 system until we really interrogate the assumptions about why we're not seeing the types of increases, especially as schools and communities become increasingly diverse and increasingly polarized over the next couple decades.
It's unfortunate we don't have a 16 or 17-year-old sitting on this couch, or a principal for that matter. So let me try and channel those two voices. NPR has been doing a series on New Orleans this year. There's a couple of final pieces that we have to air. One of them is about a kid that I've been following. His name is Clarence Plummer. He goes to collegiate academies, school that's been under a lot of pressure for all kinds of reasons. But I asked the principal there a few months back, if you could do things differently, what would you do? He said, I wouldn't push college nearly as much. He says, the big mistake we make, and remember, New Orleans is an experiment right now. It's a laboratory. It's a hybrid. It's a, privately run, publicly funded school system. Everybody from Detroit to Florida, Arizona is going there to see whether this is the future of public education. But even in that setting, the principal says the big mistake we all make is we don't meet kids where they are. Here's a kid, Clarence Plummer, who's very bright, who says, I don't want to go to college. I just don't. I think I can make music. I'm talented. I'm going to go out there and make $1 million as soon as I hit a studio who's going to take me in, and I'm just going to show what I can do. So all his teachers are kind of alarmed at this. I mean, you belong in an Ivy League school. You belong here. You belong there. The disconnect there in that setting is that you have mostly Teach for America folks. No, listen, I have nothing against Teach for America folks. But the counsel that this kid is getting from people who really don't understand his day-to-day life is, you belong in a college. Forget this idea of you being a music producer, a little Wayne of the future. And I think that the principal has it right. The school has disconnected itself from that child's future. Your sense of that?
This is a really deeply personal question. The day I arrived at Emory Elementary School as a 22-year-old kid, essentially from the Midwest, let's just put it this way. My students were not as impressed with my presence as I was. I'm serious, and that's funny. But like, I got schooled not in the way of like inner city classrooms or the way of a struggling school. I got schooled on my own toxic psychology, and what I mean by that is that I thought that by just going to this school and trying hard, that my students would respond to that. And I brought with me a whole bunch of assumptions I had to sort of interrogate over many years about what that really meant for connecting on their turf in their terms. And so I'm very partial to from experience to the idea that that's exactly what we need to do, is to understand how to connect with young people. At the same time, like I am radically opposed to the idea that we as a sector or a school should be comfortable with the idea that we put in teachers' hands something so precious, which is the notion that we should be telling young people at some point along their journey whether or not they are college material or not. And that the way I see this is that the default assumption should be twofold. Number one, higher education is an accelerator. However you want to define higher education for the vast majority of people, right? And that we need to be able to hold that out there for the facts, right? 47 times less likely to be incarcerated, $1 million cumulatively over your lifetime. Like you can run the stats about the benefits of higher ed. What I appreciate, and I think you should complete the story there, because this young man has an interesting, this story comes full circle here, but as long as you're grounding and listening, our betas, for example, lead goal-setting sessions from the ground up. We don't come in and say, like, you're going to college or else your life is over. It's like, what do you care about? What do you want to do? What's the role what's your concept of what higher education is? there's this whole range of things that we could be thinking about and really start to bake in some of that DNA of their own goals and feelings and perspectives into something that could end up being a life changer for them. And so I'll tee it back to you on that.
And I will tell it, but I want to remind you that as soon as I just finish this up, it's question time, so get your questions ready. Well, what happens to Clarence is that he finally connects with one teacher who says, okay, fine, you don't want to go to college, that's fine, that's your decision. But did you know that there's an undergraduate and a graduate program at University of Alabama that helps train entrepreneurs in the music business? Kids, light bulb goes on, says, really? They visit the school, they make the connections, kids headed there now. So there is a middle ground. There is a way to connect these kids to both their aspirations as well as to the institutions that are there for them to take advantage of. So in this case, I think it's rather the exception to the rule, but in this case you had a happy marriage of ambition, of a desire to do good work in the field that he loves, and an educator, a teacher who says, here's the pathway, let me help you. Questions from the audience, I think we're ready for those. There's a hand there, then I'll either look this way, and if not, in the back.
Okay. My name is Miles Sandler from the National League of Cities. One of the aspects in this conversation, I actually think this is one of the best conversations I've heard. One of the aspects I hear in here, and I don't hear it pulled out, is the element of culture and values. Every young person we work with has culture and values that they come into the room with. And higher education, what you want to do, who you want to be, is tied up into that culture and value. And without a young person being able to acknowledge that, being able to identify that, and how they therefore perceive their world, is almost an essential piece, I think, to how they develop their own identity and then therefore what they want to do. And so to your point, coming into a space, having an aspect like you have to go to school or you have to do this or we have to do that, without acknowledging who a person is and who their family is and how important that is. And I just want to real quick chain back to the Southeast conversation that was happening before about the sense of, again, who is the person and what do they care about? So I guess I just want to throw that out there and just get some thoughts on culture, values. How do we incorporate that in the conversation? And also how do we incorporate it in how we work with young people, particularly when we want them to get to these higher goals?
So from the outset, it's important as a white founder of an organization in education reform that I'm not only aware but try to take steps to continue to interrogate my own blind spots as a leader and to develop an organization that is committed to walking the walk of increased diversity, inclusivity, and anti-racist practice as an organization. And what that's not just measured in terms of the percentage of our betas who are betas of color or the percentage of betas or staff who are from low-income backgrounds. I think that's surface level stuff. And the stuff that's 2 or 3 levels below the iceberg, like discourse 2 stuff, is how do we know that in those moments in classrooms when these conversations are happening, there's a composition of adults that frankly both challenge and listen and incorporate all of the different things that they're hearing at the same time, right? I don't think it's as simple as just go listen channel or make sure that, someone who looks like Travis is in his classroom. I think it's a lot more deep and complex than that. And so without going into it, we should talk offline. Like we're really in the middle of what's going to end up being a multi-year process of thinking about what the implications of those 3 poles are for our young people, especially when organizations are led by people who do not share the backgrounds of the students who we're trying to help serve.
I would recommend Richard Rodriguez's Hunger of Memory. There's a powerful emotional scene in that book where he talks about going back to his family after having been an academic all-star from Oxford, from Harvard, comes back and he can't talk to his parents, can't explain what he does for a living, can't speak the language, can no longer identify with his parents' quote-unquote values, and neither can his parents. And his message is, we sacrifice, we, the second, third generation of immigrants especially, sacrifice so much in the name of success. And the lingering question is it worth it? Is it worth it? There was a question over there, and then I'll jump over here.
Hi, Zachary Goldman, Youth Service America. Previously you mentioned issues of rigor. How do practitioners deal with real policy issues that impact our ability to enforce rigor in the classroom? As a personal example, when I taught in high school last year, if more than 10% of my students received a below passing grade, I was called into the principal's office and would have a very serious discussion about my future. And in my school district, actually, there's been a recent bit of legislation that says that if a student does not turn in an assignment, all teachers must give that student 59% on the grade, just right below passing, failing. How do practitioners, both teachers and principals, deal with this really serious issue of if X amount of kids don't pass, your school is going to drop to a B, C, D rating, receive less funding, and therefore problems will happen?
You know, my short answer is that I'm glad I'm not teaching anymore. Go ahead.
I don't think we can fail our way to rigor, and with respect, I don't know what you mean by enforcing rigor. I think that the kinds of classrooms that I have seen rise to the challenge of dramatically elevated forms of academic engagement at Blue Engine have been ones marked by students becoming addicted to challenges instead of scared away by them, and that it becomes this self-reinforcing climate in the classroom where students are stretching outside of their comfort zones constantly. And I do empathize with this issue if there's cut points or if you're having conversations with folks and in the absence of students wanting to do that and being right perched on that threshold, we've all felt it ourselves before, which is like, can I really do this? Those of you who heard Joel Klein talk last night about like really getting pushed to the point where you end up believing that you can do higher levels of work. Like in the absence of that, whatever's in the groundwater in those classrooms, I think we've already missed the boat.
I'm sorry, do we have time for one more question? We don't.
Nope.
Sorry.
Thank you all very much.
I recommend you stick around for Mr. Padron. He's good.